You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey guys and gals, welcome to episode 22 of the Social Media and Politics Podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. However you're listening to us, remember to subscribe so that you get all of our latest episodes directly into your feed. And be sure to connect with us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast and also on Facebook, facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoyed our last two episodes on the French elections. On the one hand, they are over, but on the other hand, the battle for the legislative elections is just beginning. For this episode and the two coming up in the next couple weeks, we're going to be shifting focus back to the United States. And in this episode, looking at the sort of history of the internet and politics in American campaigning, and then kind of fast forwarding to 2016 elections in our next two episodes, where next week we'll be talking to the digital director of the Marco Rubio campaign, and then after that, talking with the digital director for both Scott Walker's campaign and Donald Trump's campaign. So stay tuned for those. But for this episode, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Alan Rosenblatt, who I'll introduce in just a second. But Dr. Rosenblatt actually has his own live streaming web show. That's every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. It's called the Dr. Digipol Show, and I was his guest last week. So if you want to check that out, it's pinned up on our Facebook page. We talk all about some recent elections in Europe and look ahead to the German elections in September. We talked a lot about the refugee crisis and the role of social media in that. So swing by our Facebook page and check that out, where the sort of the tables are turned and I'm getting interviewed instead of doing the interviewing. But for this podcast, I asked Dr. Alan Rosenblatt all about the sort of development of social media and politics, going back to websites and the role of digital since it's kind of early days, and where we're at today. So without further ado, let me cut straight to that tape and introduce Dr. Rosenblatt. My guest today is Dr. Alan Rosenblatt, Director for Digital Research at Lake Research Partners and Senior Vice President of Digital Strategy at Turner 4D. Dr. Rosenblatt has been working with issues at the intersection of digital technology for over 25 years, and he teaches courses on the subject at Johns Hopkins, American, and George Washington universities. You can follow Dr. Rosenblatt on Twitter at Dr. Digipol, and also catch his weekly web show by visiting the Dr. Digipol Facebook page. Dr. Rosenblatt, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics Podcast.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here.
So as I've mentioned, you've been working with how digital communication technologies are affecting politics for some time now. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in the field and your research interest in the area?
Absolutely. I started way back in the mid-'80s, conceptually. Thought of an idea in 1984 about creating a magazine that would be distributed through kiosk, custom printed based on a subscription card. Pop your card in, up pops your subscription profile. Other articles that may be available that month would be listed there that you could add a la carte, add them over, charge your card. It would print it on glossy paper with color ink, saddle stitch it, and pump it out, and you'd have a custom magazine. It was kind of a way ahead of its time. I was advised that was two whole careers, technology and content. I went the content route and got my master's and PhD in political science. But kept my fingers in the technology side. And, in my graduate school days, I spent a lot of time in the computer lab as a research methods graduate assistant, supporting SPSS, SAS, MyStat, SysStat, all the different software. So I ended up learning all about the computers. And then after I graduated, having written my dissertation on presidential use of television to manipulate public opinion, in the fall of 1992, a few months later, in early spring of 93, my roommate, who was an astrophysicist at the Carnegie Institute, took me to her office to show me Mosaic. And that was the first web browser. And immediately I saw, don't need those kiosks anymore. I made the right choice to go content instead of technology. And very quickly I realized it was going to transform how politics was done. I was a political scientist. I was teaching political persuasion, propaganda, public opinion, research methods already at George Mason University. And I really just kind of saw this whole potential and started focusing all my research efforts on that. ultimately taught the world's first college course on internet politics in the spring of 1995 at George Mason University. I co-taught it for a couple of years with Robert Dudley, who is now the Associate Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs at George Mason. And then I taught it for myself for another 3 or 4 years. And when that was all over, I did not get tenure because I didn't write a book. As you might imagine, the field evolved faster than the publication schedules of books back in those days. So I didn't want to come out with a book 3 years after I finished writing it. So I moved on. I left academia full-time and became a consultant, started doing tech policy, helping nonprofits use digital media to advance their missions. And from the very beginning of this thing, I really saw it as a social phenomenon, not as an information revolution. I always said, those who call it an information revolution were selling it short. In fact, it was a communication and revolution where people were connecting with each other, and information was simply what they were sharing. And so, that got me into early days of Usenet, See You, See Me, Internet Relay Chat. Ultimately, when the web really started to take off, 93, 94, 95, I was doing courses looking at how politicians were using the web, looking at how the web was influencing politicians, and looking at how people were interacting with each other online about politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious because if you were teaching that course in 95, I think most of the textbooks put the first political website at either 96 or 2000. So
yeah.
What were you teaching back in 95 about internet politics?
Yeah, so those textbooks are actually wrong. The first election web portal was in 1994 by an organization called Minnesota eDemocracy, which is now edemocracy.org, and I've been on their board of directors for about 10 years now. The first campaign website for an elected official was Dianne Feinstein, and that was in 1994. Mm-hmm. The first member of Congress to have a website was Ted Kennedy, and that was 1994-95. Basically, the artificial intelligence lab, I believe it was, or it could have been the media lab at MIT, contacted Chris Casey, who was a staff person in Kennedy's office, and said, "Do you want a website? We'll help you put it together and host it." And of course, they said yes. Chris Casey went on to be, ultimately, after he got Kennedy set up, he became the point person for the entire Democratic caucus in the Senate for digital stuff. The first presidential website, ironically, was the person who got me into politics when I was in second grade, and that was Pat Paulson, the comedian, who ran for president in 68, 72, and 76, and then again in 1996. And he beat Dole and Clinton by about a month or two getting his website up. He was a comedian. It wasn't a serious campaign, but it was a presidential election website. Mm-hmm. And then Clinton and Dole followed in short order. One of my biggest regrets in this space is I reached out to the Paulson campaign to just, tell them that I was a big fan and all that stuff. And I got a message back directly from Paulson saying, an email back saying, if you want to do an interview, I'm happy to. I'd love to do that. And I dragged my feet because I was in the middle of a semester. And by the time I got back around to it after the Christmas holidays, he passed away. So never got that opportunity. It did inspire me later on to walk up and introduce myself to Al Franken, who was also a big influence to me when we were both on the same flight home from the Netroots Nation in Las Vegas many years ago. So that's the early days of the internet of websites in politics. It's, of course, evolved tremendously since then. And now we should no longer think about your web presence as your website, but as a constellation of your website, all your social media presences, and all of your outposts where you're publishing on other people's websites.
Yeah, and sort of seeing the whole curve, right? What are your thoughts on what are kind of the staying features of political communication online? Like what's kind of consistent from, the original websites to today, and what's different about kind of where we are now versus where we started from in the 90s?
I love this question because I always talk about how the core strategic goals and focuses are the same regardless of the technology. and it's the tactics and functions that change. Sadly, one of the earlier manifestations or representations of the strategic paradigm that I think is the core of everybody's use of the internet was published by a man, I think his name is William Clem, writing in the White Aryan Resistance publication, which is, of course, the white nationalist movement here in the United States in the late 90s. And he talked about how to use Usenet to advance the white supremacist agenda. And there were basically three principles which you'll recognize immediately as what they did, what Al-Qaeda did, what ISIS does, and what all advocacy organizations in the Change for Good space still do as well. And that is, first, always make sure your message is getting out. Second, counter false information that's out there with correct information. And third, identify and recruit supporters to your cause. Mm-hmm. And that really is the core of what we do. I think we would probably add to that mobilizing those supporters when you recruit them, but I think that's kind of implicit in what he was saying. But we make it very explicit now in our strategic approaches. And what changes over the time has been the various platforms that you can use to use it, and each of those platforms has sort of its own imperative, and very much in the McLuhan-esque notion that the medium is the message, that each platform has its own ideological and technological imperatives, so that Twitter is different from Facebook, which is different from websites, because of the way they interact with audiences, the way they connect with audiences, and the way they allow the audiences to connect back. But I think the big changes that have happened in the last several years has been the back-end integration of these platforms, the ability of the platforms to connect with each other, the ability to pull data from all these platforms into larger data sets, the precursors and current notions of big data, to be able to understand more and more about who your audience is, what they're doing, and how you're able to move them to take action on your behalf, and then track the impact of that activity.
Yeah, and has this always been the idea behind a website, for example? Like, I think there's so much talk about everything being data-driven, and exactly what you're talking about in terms of integrating different platforms, complementing it with different data sets. That seems to be kind of the ultimate goal of these platforms for campaigns, for example. I mean, was that element there with the first websites? Like, was it about identifying VPNs or tracking traffic?
Not really. I developed kind of now it's a four-dimensional paradigm. That's where the Turner 4D comes from, of looking at how people use the web to do advocacy. It tracks to the evolution of how people use it, but each step is not a replacement for a previous step, but rather an add-on. And this is about sort of the direction of the flow of communication. Mm-hmm. So early websites were brochure websites. They were one-dimensional. The information went out, and that was essentially it. And it was that one-way flow of information. Over time, websites became more transactional, both on the commercial side and on the mobilizing people to take action, deepening relationships with people that you interact with online. This is a two-way conversation, a two-way exchange of value. The third dimension becomes that three-dimensional conversation space, which defines social media, where not only is it information going out or a two-way conversation back and forth between you and your audience, but also your audience is talking to each other, and your audience is talking to people beyond your audience. And so the idea is that conversation information is being shared in every single direction in sort of a three-dimensional space. And then the fourth dimension is the sustaining of all those activities over time, time being the fourth dimension. And so I think that what you see is that over the years, we sort of evolved and added each of those dimensions to the mix without abandoning the earlier dimensions, which is why I always get a little upset about the 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 kind of nomenclature, because that generally tends to suggest that there's a replacement, although 2.0 usually is an enhancement over 1.0, but sometimes there's a wholesale replacement of platforms, and I just want to to back it up and talk about the compiling of strategic and tactical activities with regard to communication. Also, I found that getting people who make decisions about digital strategy for their organizations and campaigns who aren't the implementers, in other words, the CEOs, the C-suite, the campaign managers, the campaign chairs, the candidates, who aren't necessarily expert in the technology and its application. It was important to translate the dynamic of what you do online into language that they completely understand. And it also reveals, I think, that especially when it comes to social media, this isn't about the technology, it's about the communication. Mm-hmm. It's about the messaging. It's about the calls to action. And so the technology is relatively basic to learn. It's like Go, seconds to learn, a lifetime to master. But it is something that campaigns need to wrap their heads around from a strategic perspective, even if they don't understand the day-to-day implications of how to use it, so that they can empower, enable, and fund the people on their staff that are doing it, and make sure that it is all integrated across whatever organization or campaign is using it.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about this, as you're saying, this idea between 1.0 and 2.0, which is that it's not necessarily linear, or it's not necessarily a progression, right? Because I've just been working on a paper on Snapchat and looking at how politicians are using it. And my kind of conclusion is that it's very much a broadcast 1.0 type of communication, much like
certainly the way they're using
it. Yeah, like a website. And I think that's ultimately kind of why campaigns didn't invest so heavily in it, because there was no way to link through to a website. So it's, even though Snapchat may be on the kind of cutting edge of applications, it in terms of campaigning or advocacy, it doesn't really change the game that much. So it isn't this type of, the platforms are evolving. It's very much just the same principles that are driving them.
Yeah. Snapchat I find is problematic because, number one, the primary audience on Snapchat are younger people who have gone there to escape the barrage of social media in order to talk only with their friends.
Exactly.
Because it's a peer-to-peer platform. So politicians and campaigns that move there do so to reach an audience that doesn't want to be reached by them in a way. And second, I think Snapchat's days are potentially numbered because Facebook and Instagram and the connection between the two have been steadily incorporating the functionality of Snapchat into those platforms to the point where I suspect that Snapchat will become superfluous and redundant.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they're moving on is this, taking over not just the disappearing messages, but also the live video, or this idea of kind of unscripted communication. What are your thoughts on that? Is this something that, from a number of people I've talked to, this is kind of the future or the next step? Does this bring any implications for advocacy campaigns, anything like that?
Absolutely. First, I would say that we have to be careful because there is a tendency to overhype video because it's a familiar face. Many political and campaign and advocacy strategists are older and yearn for a return to the simplicity of television. And the notion of video engagement is something that they're comfortable with, which might mean that their understanding of how to use live streaming video on social is not comprehensive. It doesn't really fully reach an understanding of the potential for the interactivity elements of it, which I think is really key. It is incredibly powerful. We do know that during the election, the presidential election, Donald Trump's use of Facebook Live generated 2.1 billion video views.
Yeah, this is something you wrote about, right? That it's because the live would notify users, that's kind of built into the algorithms, right? But also that people would share it. He was able, if we kind of drawing comparison to television, he was able to have this massive bottom-up type of broadcasting structure that Hillary Clinton didn't take advantage of.
Yeah, it is he basically had his own television network that had a built-in marketing and distribution functionality into it. Whereas TV becomes, you have to destination, and some TVs are set up now these days, most where you can set up a reminder. But if your TV's not on, you're not getting a reminder. I know my phone will remind me when TV shows are coming on that I want to watch because I use the TV Guide app. But if you don't set those things up, they don't happen. But on Facebook Live, as soon as you become a page fan for a particular candidate, as long as you continue to engage with their content so that their content continues to be pushed to your newsfeed, you will be notified every time they go live on Facebook Live. And that, in the last couple of weeks of the election, that was, for Trump, a couple 100 million video views, which buried Clinton. And, the difference is, I think, Trump was using video as a way to market his ideas and reach out wider and wider and wider. And Clinton was using video in order to focus in tighter and tighter and tighter on her staff and core volunteers and core supporters. And I think Trump had it right, and I think Clinton had it completely wrong. There was an opportunity for her to live simulcast her big Jay-Z, Beyonce, Get Out the Vote concert the last week or so of the election, to simulcast that concert to all of those celebrities, performers, Facebook pages, potentially reaching 135 million people. And the campaign turned down the free offer to do that. And that just seems like, and it was because they had this sort of wrong-headed view of how to use it. Now, let's be fair. Part of the problem is that Facebook Live emerged on the scene after the campaign started. And traditional campaigns, like Clinton, but not like Trump, typically lay out their budget and their campaign plan at the beginning, and then they raise money to their campaign plan, to their budget. And something that emerges in the course of the campaign that wasn't there when they planned for it early on doesn't get fully integrated because the campaigns just don't allow themselves that kind of flexibility. The same thing happened in 2008 with the Obama campaign, where they got an iPhone app 5 weeks before the election as a donation from a supporter. And when asked why they didn't develop their own, the answer was, that I heard from Scott Goodstein, who ran the president's mobile and social media program, was, well, we set out a budget in 2007, and at the time the iPhone didn't exist.
Yeah, maybe you can shed some light on this for me, because it's a question that I continuously sort of grapple with, relating to Donald Trump having more views on Facebook Live, or one candidate putting more into digital spending than another. Is it just this sheer mass? I mean, also for television advertising, if you just bombard a television station with your advertisements, I mean, it's kind of like a reducible logic down to more advertisement equals votes. I mean, is it that simple?
So there's a couple layers here, right? So there are two kinds of advertising, writ large. There's persuasion or branding advertising, and there is direct action. Persuasion branding in politics has to do with name recognition. It has to do with associating the candidate with certain values, with certain emotions, with certain policies, although not many Americans care about policy when they're voting, only about 10%. And for that kind of advertising, frequency matters. The more they see it, the more it sticks, the more they see it on multiple different channels, multiple different platforms. The effect is greater than the sum of the parts, so that if they see ads about a candidate online, on social, and on television, it's better than seeing 3 times on one of those 3 channels. And then the other side is direct action, where you're asking somebody to do something right away. And those kinds of ads, really, if the person that sees the ad doesn't take it within the first 2 or 3 times that they see it, they will never take the action. Those that are willing to take the action typically take it right away. So when it comes to campaigns, direct actions have to do with raising money, turning out to events, and getting out the vote. And those kinds of activities, the best way to advertise for get out the vote is a big barrage the morning of the vote or the night before the vote, right? Right. And not repetitive the weeks before, get out the vote, get out the vote, get out the vote. Whereas if you're trying to raise name recognition or brand a candidate, it's repetition over the course of many months that really pushes it out. So depending on what you're trying to do, and you need to be doing both, the different ads have different needs with regard to frequency.
And keeping on this idea of frequency, I mean, does that suggest that the influence or money in elections is that important to drive that advertisement? I mean, can you envision a real grassroots social media type campaign without that advertising?
Yeah, we've seen, the names escape me at the moment, but there were a couple of examples this past year, both here and in other countries, where candidates that spent millions of dollars were beaten by candidates that spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think we're in a situation where we're pitting financial capital against social capital or some combination of the two. And social capital manifests itself in the social media environment. One of the things we know is that on social media during the presidential campaigns, the amount of buzz that happened on Facebook for the different candidates, more than 98% of the buzz happened externally to the candidate's Facebook page. So they weren't driving the activity. The activity was being driven by news media, it was being driven by supporters talking about the candidate, it was driven by opponents of the candidate talking about the candidate. And so the share of voice was, which is the best indicator of potential political success on social media, was really driven by things that the candidates were not doing. And so I think that's definitely a key thing to consider, that allows you to run a campaign that becomes more effective than the budget would traditionally allow. You know, I think back to the Dean campaign in 2004. Michael Silberman, who was the webmaster earlier in the campaign, came to work one day and discovered that there were 2,000 meetups across the country, meeting every month, devoted to helping Howard Dean get elected president. They didn't create that, they discovered it. And then they worked their way into listening to what they were saying, and then ultimately working with Meetup to get some functionality that allowed them to organize those meetups, provide a conduit to send materials to the organizers of those, and turned it into a force that grew from 160,000 people to 600,000 people across Meetup. Now, obviously, other factors contributed to his lack of success in the primaries, but this was an early example of how tapping into that social capital opportunity to elevate a candidate doesn't actually require a whole lot of money.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about campaigns and the kind of strategic part behind it. But what are your takes on political communication on social media in between elections? Because one of our previous episodes was on how world leaders use Instagram. And I think 1/3 of those accounts just kind of pop up during a campaign and then they go away. So, yeah. I mean, this is more like kind of the advocacy idea. But what are you seeing in terms of how, what's the potential, first of all, for how these can be used to promote civic engagement outside of elections? And in your view, is it kind of meeting that potential?
Well, it's been more than a decade that I've been encouraging campaigns to sustain themselves online in between elections. And the answer always came back early on that we don't have the budget or the staff to be able to do that. And so that was sort of the driving force. But I think we've seen offline with Clinton, we had the emergence of the notion of the perpetual campaign. And clearly with Trump, we have that absolutely, in the sense that he's doing rallies. He's already registered as a candidate for the 2020 election, for re-election. He's having rallies. He's using his own Twitter and Facebook, personal Twitter and Facebook channels to do campaign stuff. He ran a commercial about his first 100 days, not from the White House, but from his campaign. The commercial was not accepted by CNN, creating big controversy because they said the labeling of mainstream media as fake news was false. And until they removed that label, they wouldn't run the ad, because they don't run any ads that are demonstrably false on their network. But that has all been coupled with the social media. It's all largely driven by his social media channels to keep things alive. And I think it's really important. And this goes back to that sustainability, that fourth dimension. If you're going to create a campaign online, it must be sustained. You don't want to have to rebuild your audience every 2 years, every 4 years, or every 6 years, depending on what office you're in. You want to be able to continue to grow those audiences in between. Now, we've already seen this kind of dynamic with regard to the fundraising cycle. Members of Congress start fundraising for their reelection almost the day after they're elected the first time. And so if they put the same kind of energy into building and sustaining and nurturing their social media audiences in between elections that they did in fundraising, it actually, I think, would minimize or reduce the demand for fundraising. They wouldn't have to raise as much money to be as effective. Now, of course, if both sides are doing it, then you have to go back to outdoing the other side on all aspects. But certainly, I think with social media, the potential to build a core audience that reaches out on your behalf throughout your entire service in office in between elections, separate from your official capacity on those media, is nothing short of essential to keep your campaign hopes, keep your political hopes alive. Which means that as you're doing this, you not only have to be pushing messages out, but you have to be, given what I was mentioning earlier about the 98% of the buzz on Facebook, you have to be paying attention to what people are saying across social media about you, about the issues that you're working on, about your opponent, about the issues that they're working on, so that you know how to frame your messaging, you know what policies you're pushing matter to the constituents, to the voters, and you know how they're talking about it, so you don't talk past them when you're talking about it. If your audience cares about immigration reform from a national security perspective, and all you're doing is talking about it from an economic perspective, or all you're talking about it is from a human rights perspective, they just don't hear what you're saying because you're not talking their language. And if you don't spend time doing social media content research, social media listening, social media tracking, you're going to miss how people are talking about issues in a way that helps you develop effective messaging that keeps people moving more and more in your direction.
Yeah, I think the key word that you mentioned is nurture.
Yes.
Nurture those networks because, having looked at plenty of political campaign pages, different senators and governors, their Facebook accounts, it's pretty boring. You can actually, if you scrape a large amount of them, you'll just see that it's reposting every week. We have our town hall here, but it's a very, 1.0. Yeah.
Schedules.
Exactly.
Very schedule oriented. Very, what I hated, looking at Hillary's Twitter campaign, and she was really weak on Twitter because basically her Twitter feed was dominated by one of two types of tweets. Either it was the scheduling stuff that you and I was just discussing, or it was read this in order to see how important this issue is, or watch this video in order to understand how immigration reform affects these families, right? Well, if you don't click through to read or watch what she's asking, you don't get the message because she didn't deliver it.
Right.
And we know that the vast, vast majority, easily 99% of the people who see a tweet don't click. And so that means that each of those tweets touched a person, but only 1% of them or so clicked through to get the message. And the other 99% that it touched, that touch was completely wasted. They saw your tweet and you neglected to give them the message you needed to give them to make your goal.
Right. It's this kind of passive listening or something.
Well, it's not even listening at all. It's all broadcast in hopes of driving them, because all they think about is, I want to drive them to my website so I can ask them for money. Drive them to my website so I can ask them for money. It's all they think about, instead of, well, why am I raising money? I'm raising money so I can deliver my message to them. Well, I just did.
Yeah.
And I wasted the opportunity so that I could raise money to do it again. It makes no sense.
I agree. And I think there's an interesting kind of counterpart. As you said, it takes money and it takes staff, but the European Parliament is doing a pretty good job of this, where they use a lot of free tools like Snapchat, and they do ask a question with a member of Parliament, and they have a staff. I don't know offhand. It's between 10 and 20 people, I want to say, that are actually doing this. So it takes some staff, but it's not unfeasible. And they're really active in terms of snapping people back, running these Q&As. I don't know how much social media monitoring they're doing, but I mean, it's possible, and it's pretty cost effective with how these technologies have sort of lowered the resources needed to reach millions of people. So there's a disconnect there, I think, as you're saying. There's this old school drive to website for fundraising, but there really is a lot more, I think, that could be done, and it's not that difficult.
Right. Well, I know that the Social Democrats at the European Parliament have been working with a good friend of mine, Beth Becker from Becker Digital Strategies, doing social media strategy, outreach, engagement. So I'm not surprised that you're seeing a lot of really effective communication coming out of at least that segment of the European Parliament. But you're right, this social listening, and not just listening in real time, which I know that Beth talks to them about, but doing the deeper dive. I've been working at Lake Research Partners here in the United States, which is a public opinion research firm, since October, and my complete focus has been on using content analysis to look at deep dives into what people are saying on Twitter, Facebook pages, Instagram, Tumblr, forums, in order to understand how they're talking about issues, not what the sentiment they have towards an issue or the sentiment they have towards a candidate. That is akin to presidential approval, right? I wrote my dissertation on how presidents use television to manipulate public opinion. I didn't look at whether or not presidential speeches on television increase or decrease their approval ratings, which is what all the previous research had done. I wanted to know if the president went on TV to talk about a policy, how did the public react in terms of their views of that policy? If he was defending the use of force, how did that affect people's reactions to the president's use of force? I was getting into the substance. And the same thing is true when we're looking at social media analysis at Lake. We're not looking, we can do this for sentiment. We're not looking to see whether people like a candidate or not. We want to know, what are they saying about the candidate in order to understand why they like the candidate or why they don't like the candidate. And then we want to know, well, where are they getting that information? And is it true or not? And what can we do to counter that information? And then we want to know, who are they distributing that information to? 100 people retweeting one tweet can have a reach of 500,000 people. 1,000 people can have a reach of 5 million people. And you work your way up. And some of these issues that are popping up about candidates, there was a whole smear campaign against John Ossoff down in Georgia 6, who's running to fill Health and Human Services Secretary Price's seat. He's the Democrat. And there's this whole campaign trying to smear him, that he's in Soros's pocket, that he's in Al Jazeera's pocket, that he's in Pelosi's pocket. And these efforts are being echoed by Lou Dobbs and other right-wing social media celebrities, and they're getting 5, 6, 7, 8,000 retweets on their comments. And that's reaching tens and tens of millions of people.
There was a study by a guy named Messing. I think he's at Facebook now, and I don't know when this was published, but his estimation was Fox News has an audience of about 4 million, and they can reach 40 million on Facebook by tracking their links. So, so it's out there. But let's dig into this content analysis a little bit. It's also something that I'm working on in different case studies. But what tools you're using? What's the approach? Let's get into that.
So there are a range of content analysis tools out there. Most of them tend to be fairly expensive. Some of the less expensive ones, Discover Text is a relatively affordable one. Crimson Hexagon, Sysomos, NetBase, there are a bunch of others that do this. And they allow you to look at word clouds. They allow you to look at word correlations. But then we go even further than that, and we'll pull the data back. We have a process that allows us to identify tweeters who live in a particular district who are registered voters, so that we can look at both the general conversation about an issue or a candidate on social media, on Twitter in particular, and then compare it to what actual registered voters in that district are saying about that candidate and those issues. And that allows us to do a few different things. That allows us, number one, to look at the gap between the two, because the larger body of data is a combination of registered voters, non-registered voters, organizations, and bots. And while people tend to dismiss bots as not real and therefore not important, well, people are influenced by them because it's part of that conversation, because they become feed conduits for the echo chamber, or worse, for the amplification chamber. And then
So I just want to ask, how do you find out who's a registered voter? Do you match it through a third-party database, or is it public records?
Well, you work with the voter file, and then you go through a process of finding email addresses and matching email addresses to social media accounts, and then once you have the social media accounts, you can start monitoring what they're saying on social media. That's one approach. Another approach that we've had is we look at Facebook pages and we of the candidates, of the government officials, of the key influencers and organizations in a particular congressional district or state or across the country or issue sector, and we can analyze what people are saying on those platforms. Now, some people push back and they go, well, Facebook pages and Twitter is not everybody. We're not capturing the conversations that everybody's having, but most of the conversations that everybody's having are represented in what comes through on Twitter and Facebook pages. And our goal,
if they don't start there.
And our goal is not to use social media to estimate what percentage of the population thinks this way, what percentage of the population thinks that way, but really to understand what are the ways in which people are talking about issues, which are established, which are emerging, and then we can follow that up with bringing it back and segmenting it by the voter file data so that we can see which subgroups of people seem to be already talking about one set of messages, what messages are emerging from each of those segments as well. And then we can build those into our focus groups and our surveys. And the surveys in particular, once we know what people are saying, we can start to build survey instruments that provide statistical estimations of what percentage of people are saying that in any given district or across any state or across the country, and then be able to use a combination of tracking polls and social media tracking in order to see whether or not a campaign's efforts to either boost those messages or crush those messages is succeeding.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you're someone who also has sort of one foot in academia and one foot in this sort of public opinion research, what do you think is the difference, or is there a difference between the type of work that a sort of digital consultancy firm, for example, does and an academic study? Because I've been interviewing some people who, they have teams of 20, 30 people. They're pulling massive amounts of social media data. They're publishing them in reports, which, look very legitimate. Do you think those are worthy of sort of academic press, or is there certain things that academics should pay special attention to that consultancy firms aren't interested in? Or it boggles my mind how long some of these studies take. If you have one or two researchers who it might take a year to conduct a study, whereas a firm can pump one out in a month. So how do you see that?
Well, you have to remember that on the private sector side of opinion research, it's in politics, there are two kinds of research that are being done. Well, there are more, but there's one bucket of research which is for predicting outcomes of elections, for tracking the horse race, right? And that's just, where are we now? What's likely to happen? What's our prediction? And that's the one, when people have been saying, oh, the polls were terrible, this and that, they're looking at those kinds of polls. Those are things that Gallup does, that the news media outlets do. Those are not the kinds of polls that are the main focus of candidate opinion research firms. What firms like Lake do is to understand what messages resonate with people, what messages move people, in order to help the campaign craft a message and outreach and targeting strategy that will change the prediction, that will move voters towards their candidate, even if the current horse race research says they're not getting those candidates. So what would be necessary to change the equation? And so it's a very different set of material. And those kinds of research rarely get published, rarely get shared with the public because they're proprietary and they're sort of secret sauce for campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that becomes really, really powerful and effective. And occasionally we've seen in the past where some of this data gets released after elections for, I think there's a repository at the University of Florida or Florida State that has passed, that's been around for a long time, that has post-election dumps of data from the candidate research firms. But the challenge, though, is, on this, when you look at the academic polling research, like the American National Election Survey or some of these other big annual surveys that academic research organizations like NORC or ICPSR do, these are surveys that are sometimes hundreds of questions long. They take an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours of sitting down or on the phone with a panel that they go back to on a frequent basis to ask these questions. But when it comes to political polling that is designed to identify messaging that works or doesn't work in elections, we have a situation where, we used to be able to do a 28-minute poll. Now, that doesn't work. People don't stay on the phone that long. And in fact, most of the time we're dealing with, 10, 15-minute polls. We also deal with the fact that in this current day and age, that if the poll sounds like it is negative, looking for negative messaging to work against Donald Trump, Republicans, as soon as they get a whiff of that, they hang up.
Right.
So you lose opportunities to get complete surveys results from a lot of your survey respondents because they don't want to participate. Solutions to that are to add more characteristics to the polls that are more balanced, maybe extraneous questions, but then you're paying more money for more questions that you don't really need. Mm-hmm. And of course, the bottom line is that candidates and campaigns always seem to underspend when it comes to doing research.
But even still, it seems that there's still this kind of, gauging public opinion aspect to it. I mean, what do you think, what can academics or academia more broadly bring or illuminate that polling firms aren't really looking at? Like, what are the questions that you think are sort of should be the focus of the research agenda?
Well, some of the early work that impressed me when I was in grad school that I did a little bit of grad work to replicate were to understand. There was a study by Conover and Feldman on what the 7-point ideological scale meant, and to look at what does it mean to be a conservative, what does it mean to be a liberal, what does it mean to be a moderate in this day and age, because the configuration of issues that fall into those categories are different and they evolve over time. So that's one thing I think it's important for us to understand. But then I think more and more the deeper questions of sort of ghettoization and severe extreme partisanship, mm-hmm. and building understanding what it is that people, not just how they see themselves on those scales, both the ideological and the partisan scales, and understanding how they label themselves, but to understand how they label other people. Mm-hmm. What is it that they don't like about liberals? What is it that they don't like about conservatives? What is it that they don't like about other people who disagree with them? And so that's, I think, a really big question. The other question that I think is really important is where are they getting their information? There is some work that's been coming out of the Pew Project for Excellence in Journalism, or the Pew Journalism Project. I think it's been renamed recently, but it's through the Pew Research Center, on the real ghettoization and segmentation of news sources. The left is getting their news from one set of sources, and the right is getting their news from another set of sources. And there's very little overlap, and there's very little agreement between the sources. And And I think if you look at the list of sources, the sort of fact-checking organizations are much more critical of the sources that the right is getting their information from, and much less critical of the sources the left is getting their information from, although there are extreme and questionable sources on both sides.
Yeah, there's kind of distrust in the...
Yeah, and the distrust is, it's a propaganda effort. They're basically saying, oh, you made a mistake on that article, therefore all of your news reporting is fake. And that is crap. That is a total crap. But if it gets repeated over and over and over again, which was what that commercial that Trump tried to run that CNN wouldn't allow to run on his 100th day, if there's a complete repetition from a source that people trust saying over and over this false information, they buy it. It becomes truth because of its frequency of exposure.
My last question then would be a sort of broader one, which is, and we've talked on a number of themes in terms of ghettoization, et cetera, but in terms of the potential for social media for civic empowerment or what have you, I mean, do you think that these platforms or the web more broadly is good or bad for democracy?
I am an optimist, and I think that the potential for good is extraordinary. I also am a realist and recognize that the potential for it to be perverted, for it to be misused, is also strong. So as a rule, I think that it can go both ways. I think that the potential for it to democratize and empower is really important. But we have to remember that when we amplify everybody's voices, we discover what has always been true, and that is that a lot of people don't have the facts they need in order to understand the world as things are actually happening. We see that there are some people out there that have nefarious agendas, and they get their amplification as well. And so all the things that happened, sort of below the surface before social media now happens publicly. And so while I have great faith in its ability to increase democratization and increase public awareness and public knowledge about politics to create an informed electorate, it also has the ability to do the opposite. And they both happen simultaneously, which is why I think no matter what we do when it comes to social media, the most important thing, or one of the very most important things, is to focus on making sure the electorate is media and information literate, that they know how to use the technology to get information, that they know how to evaluate the truth or falseness of information, that they know how to evaluate the biases of media sources, so that they can be not just an informed electorate, but a discerning informed electorate.
Totally agree. Dr. Rosenblatt, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. This has been the kind of conversation I love to start my day with.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Alan Rosenblatt, Director for Digital Research at Lake Research Partners and Senior Vice President of Digital Strategy at Turner 4D. Be sure to check out his weekly web show, the Dr. Digipol Show, by swinging through their Facebook page. And if you drop by our Facebook page, Social Media and Politics Podcast, you'll find the latest episode where I'm a guest on the show. Thanks again for tuning in to the Social Media and Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.